Good evening and welcome back to the final lecture of the day. We have had very engrossing and thought-provoking session. I'm sure that this will be no different. In this session, we shall be talking about care and its ethics. And it gives me immense pleasure to welcome Professor Eva Kittay, who will be presenting her thoughts on the subject and acquainting us with the various aspects of caregiving. The central question is, are caregivers friends or are they foes? But before I invite her onto the platform, it is my great pleasure to call upon Professor Shubhangi Vaidya to chair and moderate the session. Professor Vaidya.
So do I go ahead?
Yeah, please.
Okay, so good morning and good evening, depending upon where all of you are. Welcome, Professor Kittay. It's a real pleasure to have you on this forum, and I'm really looking forward to this evening. Firstly, let me begin by congratulating Professor Someshwar Sati and the team at the Kirori Mal College, the Disability Studies Center at Kirori Mal College, for bringing together this galaxy of scholars and researchers to actually speak about disability research, which is such an important issue and such an important area of discourse, particularly in the context of the pandemic and what we have seen over the past couple of years. And today it's my pleasure and honor to welcome Professor Eva Kittay, who I greatly admire as a scholar, and I feel a great personal affinity and kinship also, being myself the parent of an adult with disability. Oh. So yeah, so reading your work resonates deeply, and really, I think the joy and the learnings that you have derived from the life of your daughter are something that so many of us find so deeply resonant and we identify so totally with. And in a sense, you embody the feminist notion of the personal being the political. So Professor Kittay is a philosopher whose primary interests include feminist philosophy, ethics, social and political theory, metaphor, and the application of these disciplines to disability studies. She's a distinguished professor of philosophy at Stony Brook University and a senior fellow of the Stony Brook Center for Medical Humanities, Compassionate Care and Bioethics, also a Guggenheim Fellow, and the author of innumerable path-breaking articles and books, some of the most famous or some of the most notable of which are Love's Labor, Essays in Women, Equality and Dependency, which first came out in 1999, a text I'm sure most of us are from the discipline of disability studies as well as women's studies are familiar with. Women and Moral Theory, the Subject of Care, Theoretical Perspectives on Dependency and Women, the collection Cognitive Disability and the Challenge to Moral Philosophy, which really opened up a new field of inquiry in philosophy. And most recently, in 2019, Learning from My Daughter, The Value and Care of Disabled Minds, which provides a theoretical as well as a personal discussion of cognitive disability from a philosopher and a mother's lens. It challenges constructs of reason, of normalcy, the notion of the good life, and articulates an ethics of care. Today, in fact, this is precisely what Professor Kittay will be talking about: disability and an ethics of care, friends or foes. So without any further ado, I request you, Professor Kittay, to please go ahead with your talk. Really looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's very exciting to be all the way in India and to be in my own living room. I'd much rather be there with you in person, and maybe one day that will be possible. I'm really honored to be part of this colloquium. So without further ado, may I share my screen? Why is it not?
Can the administrators help?
It's asking me for full access or something. I'm using a different computer. I've not usually used this computer for. No, this is the computer I always use. I'm sorry. I don't know what's the problem. Is there something on your end that you need to do?
Can the host just check out if there is anything?
Ma'am, are you using other device for screen sharing?
Could you please allow her to share her screen?
Maybe you can make her co-host. That will help her to share the screen.
We have already made them co-host. Yeah.
Okay, even if you aren't able to share your screen, you can just share it with us. We'll share your screen. So we'll share your presentation.
Would you like to do that, Professor? They can share your presentation from this end, and you can go ahead with your.
It's telling me I have to quit Zoom now, or do it later.
Okay, yeah. So I am hoping that
let me quit and sign in again, because it's telling me to have to quit in order to do this. So I'm going to leave you for a moment, and I will be back in a moment. This is not my normal computer. That's why I'm having a little difficulty here. Leave meeting. Okay, let me try it now.
Yes, we can see it. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Good. So let me put this on slideshow. Oh. The pleasures of working from home. Skip share screen. Got it. Okay. All right. So there's a quarrel between people who do care ethics and those who are disability theorists. And in this paper, I'd like to lay out what the quarrel is, ask if it's inevitable, and see if there is some way to reconcile the differences. So proponents of the constructivist conception of disability, also the critical disability studies, various different names that are now given, especially when they espouse a strong theory, especially when they espouse a strong theory of the social model of disability, are committed to the claim that what is properly called disability is primarily a function of the social and political conditions. The emancipatory thrust of that, of this body of work has leaned heavily on rights, human rights, civil rights, political rights. Disability theorists have attempted to decouple disability from inherent disadvantage and so remove the stigma of dependence and care. They have worked to allow disabled people to live independently and to counter the view of disabled people as incompetent, pitiful, burdens on others. They've decried what they call the social construction of disability. Writers such as Michael Oliver have maintained that dependency itself is central to the fact that disability is experienced as a particular kind of social problem. Positing their goal as the full integration of people with such minority bodies. Recent work by an American philosopher, Elizabeth Barnes, has spoken of disabled bodies as minority bodies into daily social and political lives of the majority. This critical theory primarily stands in contrast to medical approaches to disability, approaches that locate the dis of disability, not in the socio-political domain, but in the body itself. This, can you see my full screen, or do you see the little boxes there? I'm not sure.
We can see your screen. We can see your screen. Go ahead.
See the full screen. Okay. This disabled body requires fixing to restore normalcy to typicality to whatever extent possible. To the extent that medicine falls short, the idea is to sustain the body, cause it less pain and suffering, and for the rest, hand it over to caretakers. Care then appears to be the very antithesis of the emancipatory goals of full equal rights, participation, and independence demanded of those who are demanding dignity. On one view, our dignity gives us each equal claims to human rights. And in turn, our inherent dignity as beings who can fashion and pursue our own good is affirmed by the possession of these rights. The retort to care appears to erode dignity. Proponents of an ethic of care, on the other hand, have attempted to rehabilitate and revalue a concept that too often carries with it saccharine sentimentality, and revalue a concept that too often also carries a stigmatizing paternalism. They have insisted on the need to recognize and accept certain sorts of dependencies, claiming that all human life is steeped in dependency, some good, some bad, and some neither. They've attempted to unmask independence as a fiction and a myth that is overvalued to the detriment of the vulnerable and disenfranchised. Independence, independence for all its vaunted value, they've pointed out, despite all the negativity associated with it, underscores our connectedness. It can be a source, sorry, independence, they pointed out, can be a source of isolation. Dependency, despite all the negativity associated with it, underscores our connectedness. They do not view care as diminishing dignity, but making dignity realizable for those who need care. They elevate care as a value, if not more fundamental, than even rights. Now, some of this clash has been softened a bit by one of the original writers on social theories of social theory of disability, and that's Colin Barnes. And he writes that specific forces of political, cultural, social factors that corrode that come to the disadvantage of impairment, that the social model is really only an approach to public policy. It's not to say that all disability is social. It's to say that disability requires certain public policies, and that even the medical aspects are, in a way, part of the social environment in which a disabled body lives. So, is the antipathy of disability activists and care theorists to care warranted? Does an ethic of care take full advantage of the negative valence, take full account of the negative valence that disability theorists and activists assign to care? Is the conflict inherent? The claim in this essay is that care theory and disability theory need each other. Care theory needs disability theory to help it find a sense of care, which is not merely descriptive, but genuinely normative, care as it should be. Disability theory needs care theory because, properly construed, care theory can provide the basis for dignity for minority bodies, bodies that, even with far better accommodations, sometimes will still be functionally ill-suited to the physical and social world we inhabit. The theoretical perspectives we adopt, often and perhaps inevitably, are a function of the position we occupy. Those who are disabled scholars and activists can speak for themselves, and some of the most vocal have argued that what disabled people need is their full measure of civil rights. My perspective comes from my location as a temporarily able-bodied mother of a disabled person, my daughter. I've written a great deal about Sasha, a beautiful woman, now 51 years old. Sasha is lovely, patient, sociable, incredibly sweet, but very strong-willed. She loves her life. She takes great pleasure in the things that move her, the people she loves, her food, and above all, her music. While disability scholars who can speak for themselves demand nothing about us without us, my daughter cannot speak for herself because she cannot speak. Not only does she have no expressive language, but she cannot walk or toilet herself or really do any self-care independently. Disability may be socially constructed in many ways, but Sesha's disability will not go away, no matter how many supports and accommodations we put in place. She needs care, lots of it, merely to survive from day to day. From my perspective as a mother and carer of a person with such disabling conditions, care is central to my understanding of disability. As a philosopher interested in our moral lives, an ethic of care has been the theoretical perch from which to think about disability. It is from this same post that I have formulated the belief that working in unison, these two areas of inquiry and activism can help fashion an ethical theory that is truer to the human condition than traditional theories, ones that have rarely acknowledged the need for care or the presence of disabled lives. Yet contestation over terms and values of disability theory and ethics may be overstated. The rights discourse favored by disability scholars and advocates, especially when focused on negative rights of liberty from interference, generally presupposes agents who are independent, fully functioning, and rational. That is, those who can make rights claims on one another. But the rights included in the list of human rights need not be seen as the converse of care. Rights such as the right to food, shelter, affinitive relations are often realized only through the caring work of others. Fully dependent human beings, such as my daughter, realize their right to food only if there are caring others who can provide that food and assist with her feeding. An adult quadriplegic can realize his rights to mobility, employment, and even participation in political rights only if he is assisted by a personal attendant or family caregiver. Since we all experience periods in our lives when we are dependent on the care of others, our ability to claim rights is similarly dependent on the care of others. To the extent that the lives of people with disabilities are especially precarious, and they're precarious with respect to social systems and bodies' shortcomings, they may be more dependent on care for more of their lives than those who are not disabled. But at the same time, whether or not we currently have a disability, none of us can avoid dependency. All our lives are precarious. All of us need care at some point, and all need to know that we can be cared for when we need care. So I will start talking about the stigma of independence and what I call the illusion of independence. We need a clear-eyed view of dependency. People with disability need to acknowledge the importance of care and the limits of independence. Care ethicists need to acknowledge the possible damage and disadvantage in dependence and the ways in which care can be infantilizing. I propose that what is needed is a clear-eyed view of dependence and independence alike. We need an ethics of care that disability advocates and scholars can embrace. Seeing dependency writ large through the extended and extreme dependency of my daughter, I've come to understand that while much dependency is socially constructed, independence is no less socially constructed. Moreover, such as dependency, has not merely been a burden or a problem. It has been the occasion for a particular sort of interaction and a particular sort of closeness. This extreme dependency can shed light on the dependency we all experience at some time in our life. If we step back, we might ask, why do humans who belong to a thoroughly social species so despise dependence? Dependence on others allows for needed care, knowledge, culture, technology, political and social economic goods, the sine qua non of human life in any era. A reliance on government services, which is, at least here, pejoratively called welfare dependency, counts as a primary advantage of a modern, relatively well-ordered state. We might as well decry our dependence on air. Senator Patrick Moynihan, a rather revered liberal US senator in the late 20th century, spoke of dependency as an incomplete state of life, normal in the child, abnormal in the adult. He wrote, "In a world where completed men and women stand on their own feet, persons who are dependent, as the buried imagery of the word denotes, hang. The sense of being at another's mercy, dangling by a string of a noose about to tighten, is what frightens us so at the thought of dependence. And no matter how forcefully we argue that dependence is inevitable and universal, unless we address these worries, we fail to move beyond the stigma and the terror. What then are these concerns? When one is dependent, one cannot meet important needs and wants oneself. We need others, but they then have the power to extend or withhold their assistance. And with this power comes the ability to dominate the dependence. Furthermore, a willing caregiver may find herself unable to provide the needed care because of her dependence on a provisioner who has not discharged their responsibilities. A willing provisioner may fail to provide because others on whom she depends have failed her. What we see here is that dependencies can be and usually are nested in other dependency relations. This nesting or linking of dependencies and interdependencies allows society to function and be well ordered. But the failures also mean that the dependent may be left with needs and wants and desires that are not addressed. In asymmetrical relationship, such as dependency relations, we are secure only as long as the other is able and chooses to provide for us and to care about what we care about, which some call, which I call anyway, somewhat bending the common use, our cares. Moreover, the asymmetry leaves us with a debt of gratitude that we may be unable to repay, resentful in having to repay it. Not only do we remain vulnerable, but but the sense that we cannot repay a debt of gratitude gnaws at our pride and our sense of equal worth. Another exceedingly difficult feature of dependency is that those things we most care about, which we most need and want, are the very things that make us more vulnerable. Is there a problem? Okay. We can avoid much of this vulnerability, but it comes at the cost of not caring about things that make things and people, things that make life possible and worth living. The same can be said for the people we depend on. The thicker the dependency relations are, the more value they bring into our lives. Value that goes well beyond the meeting of needs. But these relationships are also the most fraught because losing them is losing so much. And it is the person with the greater power in the inevitably asymmetric relationship of dependency who gets to decide whether the relationship remains intact. Again, sorry, something just happened here. Something just happened to my text. Find it again. Pieces of paper that you can just turn. So again, the dependency makes us powerless in the face of something we really value. There is indeed much about dependency that is to be feared. There are also historical, political, socio-legal, and psychological dependencies, whose genealogies the philosopher Nancy Fraser and the historian Linda Gordon have tried to excavate. But we are talking about dependence on others that are tied to inevitable biologically based constraints that reduce our ability to care for ourselves. Those at the beginning and end of life, throughout life, when we are injured, ill, or too frail, and whenever we are without important needed capacities. These inevitable dependencies, these inevitable human dependencies, such as death, most inevitable dependencies, we accept and we meet them with resilience. We don't love the inevitability of death, but we recognize it as just part of human life. The need for food is inevitable, but we accept it as a condition of our lives. More interesting still, this inevitable need becomes the site of cultural identity, family, warmth, artistry, and sociality. Dependency in this sense may not always be palatable, but neither must it be undesirable. It is part of any human life lived intertwined with others. The paradigm of the inevitable dependent is the child. Adults who are dependent or infantilized are viewed as incompetent, asexual, cute, or in their second childhood, and presumed to be proper objects of scorn and paternalistic concern. We see adults in a dependent state and are reminded of our own infantile vulnerability. Beyond this emotional terror, there is a conceptual error at play. The mistake is related to one in which we attribute to all members of a class the characteristics of the paradigm. Robins, who you see here jumping in the very back, are paradigmatic birds, and penguins, who you see down there swimming, are also birds. Yet it would be a serious mistake to treat a penguin as if it were a robin. Even the features that the two species share can have different roles in the lives of the two different kinds of birds. Both robins and birds need wings for mobility, but those of the robin are as useless in the water as the penguin's wings are in the air. Infants, people such as my daughter, more advanced Alzheimer's patients, are dependent on others to be fed. However, what they eat, appropriate ways to feed them, and their response to being fed may be as different as the wings on robins and penguins. Being treated with dignity, whatever else it may be, is being treated in a way that we can remain recognizable to ourselves and those who love us. If we treat people with disabilities and people who are dependent in different ways with equal dignity, then presuming an 80-year-old woman is an infant offends against dignity because it fails to accord with both the woman's subjective sense of who she is and the objective facts of the life she has lived. We fail to recognize and respect her. We treat her as lesser, view her as undeserving of equal dignity. This is the danger that takes hold in our imaginings about being dependent. This conceptual error is comparable to racial or gender stereotyping. So let's try to get a clear-eyed view of independence. To contest the image of the disabled person as an infantilized object of paternalistic concern, disability scholars and activists have offered a counter-narrative. With the appropriate accommodations and personal assistance who would be under their direction, disabled people could live independently. Judy Heumann, an early champion of independent living, promotes independence as a mind process, not contingent on a normal body. The counter-narrative depends on the shift from the understanding of independence as self-sufficiency to one of independence as self-determination. And it's exemplified in the independent living movement, also in the American with Disabilities Act, the various other legislation that has been enacted here and globally through the UN and I'm sure in many other nations. Taking their cue, but in the United States, it has a particularly flavor of the civil rights movement. The British Council of Disabled People wrote, however good passivity and the creation of dependency may be for the careers of service providers, it is bad news for disabled people and the public purse. It is a viewpoint which meets strong resistance with our organization. Sorting out these different senses of independence promoted by the independent living movement has not always been easy, even for the disabled individual himself. Medical sociologist and disability rights activist Irving Zola writes that getting to some place under my own steam left him physically spent when he arrived, and so less able to perform the tasks that were important to him. Instead, he discovered the independence to which he aspired was the quality of life that he could live with help. The counter-narrative redefined independence as including the vast network of assistance and provisions that make modern life possible. Then, as literary and disability scholar Leonard Davis writes, the seeming state of exception of disability turns out to be the unexceptional state of existence. While Davis's attempt to normalize the assistance needed for independence is commendable, I believe there's still more to be said for altogether unmasking the fiction of independence and self-reliance. As long as we maintain that fiction, those who are the most disadvantaged when dependency needs go unmet will remain marginal members of our society. Public access to care and assistance will remain miserly, and full participation and integration of people with disabilities will be hampered. Beyond this, the applicability of the independent living movement may be limited. While the BOC derives the idea that disabled people need to be looked after, some people with disabilities and frailties do indeed require looking after. Surely we should give all people as much self-determination and control over their lives as possible. But some impairments affect the capacity for self-determination, just as some impairments affect mobility or sensory perception. Another problem with arguments for independence is that they trade on the belief that fewer public expenditures are needed when disabled people are independent, that independent living is less costly than residential placement, that productive disabled people will replenish public coffers. The arguments strategically counter the image of the disabled person as burdens on society. Unfortunately, they also feed the sentiment that the public should not have to be responsible for dependents who cannot pay their own way. Not only does this view disadvantage those least able to fend for themselves, shifting the cost and care to struggling families, but it is also liable to hurt those whose ability to be self-determining requires increased, not reduced, expenditures. Relatedly, arguments that bind independence to productivity are useful insofar as most people desire meaningful work. But for some, this may not be possible. And for them, meaningless tasks take the place of more fulfilling activities. It's an especially punishing view for those whose capacities for productive labor diminish with age. Finally, the demand for independence for disabled people relies heavily on the availability and compliance of caregivers. But there's a danger that the independence of disabled people may render the assistance indivisible and subordinate. Michael Oliver criticizes the understanding of disability by professionals, who he writes tend to define independence in terms of self-care, such as washing, dressing, toileting, cooking, eating without assistance. Still, don't we have to ask, what about those who do the washing, dressing, and toileting? Although, in fact, at least in the United States, family members most often fill the role of paid attendants, the preference for many disabled adults, interestingly, do not favor this arrangement. And the idea of independence to which disabled people aspire is, according to some, best served by a paid stranger with whom one has a thin relationship of employer to employee. In order to sustain a sense of independence, or as I suggest, the illusion of independence, the personal attendant must become invisible. Lynn May Rivas speaks of the carer needing to turn over the authorship of her work to the disabled person. Drawing on interviews she had separately with carers as well as with disabled people utilizing personal assistance, she notes, ironically, handing over the authorship of caring labor may itself be the most caring part of care. But then again, she writes, how could something unseen be completely valued? But the attendants valued the work insofar as it was a labor of love. The logjam is, I believe, a feature of the overvaluation of independence and the stigma of dependence. So can we go beyond the stigma of dependency and the overvaluation of independence? A consideration of dependency then forces a number of questions. Can one still provide the benefits to be gained by disabled people's demands for independence without re-stigmatizing those who do not benefit? Can we accept the inevitability of dependence without denying the negative effects of an imposed dependency on the lives of many disabled people? And can we accept reliance on dependency workers without subordinating their interests to those of the disabled person? Can we accept the asymmetry of dependence as part of the human condition and not fear exploitation or abuse? Our powerlessness in the face of forces over which we have little control, and our need to unite with others who are willing to work in concert to provide symmetrical care when necessary, requires humans to develop relationships of trust, create systems of entitlement that make assistance and access predictable, and to form affective bonds that motivate others to take our cares as their own, and enjoins us to take another's cares as ours. While the vulnerabilities of the dependent in a relation of dependency are multiple, unfortunate outcomes are not inevitable if dependency is managed in the right ways by the right individuals with the right moral and emotional commitments and backed by the appropriate institutional supports. A care ethic opts for better ways to recognize and create conditions that foster relations of dependency that are replete with affective bonds and a sense that each participant has received her due. Relationships which can transform, which can transform otherwise unpleasant intimate tasks into times of trust, demonstrations of trustworthiness, gratifying and dignifying to both the caregiver and the recipient of care. A truly independent life, one in which we need no one and no one needs us, would be a very impoverished one, even if it were possible. The person with an impairment who requires the assistance of a caregiver is not the exception, but a person living out a possibility in any human life, our inevitable dependency. At best, life can be independent to the degree that it can be self-determining, and most of us, disabled or not, can be self-determining to some degree. But with self-determination comes the presumption of self-sufficiency, and such self-sufficiency is always a lie, whether or not we are disabled, and we're all better off if we refuse to live a lie. An ethic of care that takes care as a supreme value And while the scope of care is restricted by contextual considerations in any one deliberation, it aims at regulative ideal. I think I don't know if I already read that. I didn't read that yet. But we're moving on to an ethics of care in brief. An ethic of care that takes care as a supreme value. And while the scope of care is restricted by contextual considerations in any one deliberation, it aims at a regulative ideal that everyone is cared about and receives the care they need, that everyone is enfolded into a circle of care. Now, what does such care ethic look like? Well, it provides a tripart conception of care as labor, as an attitude, or disposition, and a virtue. As a labor, caregiving requires attending to the needs of another, putting aside one's own needs for someone more vulnerable, and often becoming intimate with the body and the bodily functions of the cared for. The labor of care is, for the most part, carried out on the body of the individual and requires dignifying both our unique individuality in his or her embodied existence and respecting our material connectedness to one another. The custodial maintenance of the body is not yet care in the fully normative sense. Care in this sense requires an appropriate attitude, an open responsiveness essential to understanding what another person needs or wants. Care in a fully normative sense is also a virtue to be cultivated, a disposition to make an attitudinal shift as it is called for. Those in whom this virtue is present are able to respond to people in need of care, even when the parties are not bound by intimacy. Carers not only care about and for those whom they encounter, they also care about care. They place a supreme value on caring itself, caring, that is, in its fully normative sense. So what do I mean by care in its fully normative sense? And why do we need such a notion? An ethic of care that disability activists and scholars can find acceptable will need to be one that is grounded in current practices, but is based on the best practices of care. Answering needs that diminishes those who need care is rightfully disparaged, as when persons and institutions, those that are state-sponsored, for example, address what they take to be the needs. But simultaneously, running roughshod over the agency of dependent and disabled, but as they're saying, as the state is saying what they think the disabled person needs, they run roughshod over the agency of the dependent and the disabled person. For the point of care is not only to address and respond to needs. That's a means to the end. The end itself is to promote the flourishing of the cared for. Note that if we take that as the ultimate end, then insofar as flourishing is a value for everyone, care is a value for everyone. For we all sometimes need care to flourish. The fully normative sense of care, which in my writings I designate with small caps, is what we need to serve as our guiding virtue. And such an ethic, I think, is an ethics of care. The moral virtues are already defined normatively. Consider, we never speak of a person as being too just, We speak of a person being too rigid or too lax in the application of its laws or principles. Or we may say that a person serves up too stern a form of justice. What we do not say is that someone offers up bad or poor justice. If a decision which ought to be rendered justly is bad, it may be sheer revenge, or it may be heedless of the rule of law, but it is not just. For the outcome to be just, it must be something worthy of approval as a justice, although a just act might not be sufficiently, let's say, merciful. The point of caring is to benefit the cared for, and so the person who is presumably cared for says that, when a person who is presumably cared for says that the carer cares too much, must have heard that expression many times, they are complaining that the benefit the carer assumes she is bestowing is not a benefit at all. That is, the person who cares too much fails to serve the point of care, which is to benefit another. Another way to see this is to consider Aristotle's view that a virtue is a mean between two vices. In the case of care, one is over solicitude, and that gives us paternalism. That is the unwanted attention of another person and their needs. Alternatively, or the other extreme is a neglect born either of indifference or a misplaced respect for another's autonomy. That is a failure or an unwillingness to perceive the other's real need of one's assistance. In either case, and there we get neglect. So care has to traverse that narrow passageway. In either case, and we'll come back to this slide later, in either case, the aim of benefiting the other goes untried. In the case of care, what is crucial is that the action of the putative carer needs to be taken up as care, needs, in other words, to have a beneficial effect on the person whose needs are under consideration. This means that however much the intention to care may be motivating the carer, caring too much is not care at all. So what is care? We can provide rudiments of an ethic of care. The definitions that I'm going to give here. There's a strange sound in the background. Might anyone know what that's coming from? We can provide the rudiments of an ethics of care with some definitions and principles. The definitions spell out the aim and the appropriateness of recipients of care, caring practices. Excuse me, it's very does anyone know?
Somebody has their mics on. Would you please switch them off? I think somebody called Ravikant has his mic on. Would you please switch it off, Ravikant? Thank you.
Okay.
Carry on, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. So the first definition we can give of care is the telos of caring practices is the flourishing of those who need care. The second definition, those who need care are those who will be harmed if care is not provided. Those most clearly in need of care are those who are inevitably dependent. We can also talk about a set of principles which serve as a regulative ideal. Ideals that are, while not entirely realizable, are the aspirations of the provision of care. It's what we aim for. So the first principle is that the flourishing of those in need of care has to be a flourishing as endorsed by, or implicitly or explicitly, by the one who is cared for. And this means that the carer needs to be guided by the regulative ideal of what I've called elsewhere in Love's Labor, a transparent self, a self that attempts to bracket its own needs, desires, prejudices, preconceptions, and attends to what the flourishing of the cared for requires. The activity of the carer, it also means that the activity of the carer has to be taken up by care, by the cared for. This is a very important point that I'll talk more about later. The second principle, the regulative ideal of care is to provide care by assisting those who require care in meeting needs and wants that are genuine and legitimate. That's to say, you don't, as a carer, you don't have to meet every need. Some are not real needs. Genuine needs have both an objective and subjective basis, and if not attended to, will impede the individual's flourishing and result in harming the individual. And the care attends not only to needs, the carer also attends to wants, but not all wants are what I call legitimate wants. Legitimate wants that are those wants that can be satisfied without thwarting another's, including the carer's, possibility of receiving care from others. This requires that when we work to satisfy a particular want, which is less urgent than a need, that we consider whether doing so involves harming or doing some injustice to others. These principles involve regulative ideals that may never be realized. To say that they are regulative ideals is to claim that they ought to guide our actions and our decisions and the ways in which we care. Regarding the first principle, no one can achieve total transparency. It is true that our self-interest, our biases, and opacity regarding the mind of another can only be partially overcome. Nonetheless, transparency is what we aim for when we care, for what we need to try to set aside, transparency is what we aim for when we care, for we need to try to set aside our own wants and prejudices and work as best as we can to access what the other cares about. Now, so someone's raising their hand. Yes? Interpreter? Yes?
Yes. Actually, ma'am, we have to shift the interpreter. Sorry for interruption. Thank you so much.
Oh, okay. Are we okay now? Okay. Right. So what I've been saying is that a transparent self is a regulative ideal. No one can achieve it fully. But what we can do is to try to be self-reflective about when we say someone needs something, is it that they need it, or that we want them to have it, or that we think they should need it? It is only when we are instrumental in the flourishing of the cared for, or assist the cared for's ability to gain an important benefit, that is, when they take up our care as caring, can we say we succeeded in caring for the other. Similarly, with respect to the second principle, We sometimes cannot tell if something the other cares about is truly an urgent need. Or sometimes we cannot determine correctly what the need is. And it is clear that we can never know for certain that satisfying another's want will not cause harm to another or exasperate some injustice. Nonetheless, we should attempt to access the legitimacy of the want, especially when the care we are addressing is not an urgent need. I believe both people with disabilities and those doing caring labor can embrace an ethic founded on such a normative conception of care. Now, I don't think I have time to go into more of an articulation of an ethics of care. Can you give me some guidance on this? How, I don't know how familiar people are with an ethic of care. Can I get any guidance? Yes?
Do go on, ma'am, for another 10 minutes or so, if you would like to.
Okay, I think I'm going to skip it because I think it's something you can more or less get elsewhere. So let me go to some of the points that I want to make here. Care can go wrong. There are many ways in which the attempt to care can go wrong. The person who does care work poorly may give preference to her own interests and desires, even when detrimental to his charge. She may be inattentive, unmindful, neglectful, or might exert her dominance, abuse her relationship of power over a vulnerable individual. It is not just negligent and abusive behavior that can sabotage care. Even good intentions can interfere with the care that is genuinely needed if the carer's desire to help is more about her desire to help than about the needs of the cared for. Good intentions, these are, this is what I'm skipping over. Good intentions do not produce good care. Good intentions alone don't produce good care. If the carer is incompetent or badly trained, or if what the carer wants to impose on the cared for is based only on the carer's conception of the good, disregarding the carer for's own response, what the carer presumes is good for the cared for may be something that the cared for rejects as good, or as something that is good for her. Central to these failures and abuses are asymmetries in power between the caregiver and the cared for. Carers themselves often have less economic status than those they care for, sometimes even physically less powerful than those who they care for. But the essential dependence of the cared for on the dependent remains even when other forms of power favor the cared for. The concept of care allows us to see that the question for a care ethics is how to prevent power from turning into dominance and instead make that power enriching primarily to the cared for without effacing the care. The last part is going to address the idea that the cared for has to take up the other's actions as care. And ethics of care, I've said, walks the line between the skilla of paternalism and the charybdis of neglect. To navigate this narrow passage is crucial if an ethics of care is to be useful for disabled people. Given that an ethics of care is a particularistic ethics, we are not in possession of maxims that can be readily generalized. We do have general criteria by which to determine, we don't have that general criteria by which to determine if the actions are carried out by the carer are really care. We don't have that normative standard that we do in many other ethical theories. So how do we know whether our actions are care? The answer depends on whether or not my action is taken up as care by the other. To bring the point home, consider the following scenario. I see a plant that is wilted. I pick up a pitcher next to it to water the plant. Now, unbeknownst to me, the pitcher is filled with vinegar. I pour it into the plant. Predictably, the plant begins to wither instead of perk up. Have I cared for the plant? Most of us would answer no. And I believe the example shows that we have a strong intuitive sense that a thing's or a person's well-being must be positively affected by our actions if our actions are to count as care. At the very least, it ought not to be negatively affected. We can say that the action needs to be taken up as care by the cared for. Plant cannot say whether we have cared for it, but it shows it when it responds positively to our actions. Generally, people can make it clear that what we have done is something they do or do not welcome. Even people such as my daughter who cannot speak can to some degree communicate whether what we do is welcomed or not. The most important lesson here is that if the person we are trying or purporting to care for doesn't accept that we are meeting their cares or ameliorating their condition, then as much as we intend to care, we are not yet caring. There are many complicated ways in which our actions can be taken up as care or projected. The taking up of an action as care can be deferred, it can be partial, it can be rejected even when it is answering a genuine need. But for the action to be care, it must be, as Noddings put it, completed in the other. If what I do to promote the good of the cared for is something that they, upon good reflection and information, were the cared for able to reflect and process this information, would not want us to do, then we act paternalistically, not caringly. So I distinguish paternalistic action from caring action. Thus, care has to be guided by the good as the person cared for determines it. In respecting what the person would want for herself, then, to provide care is also to recognize the dignity of the agentive self, the agent. We recognize the person herself as she recognizes herself. What I suggested in insisting that care has to be taken up as care by the cared for is that care is congruent with the respect we give to those whose dignity we respect. In fact, if care is to be care, this sort of care necessitates respect for the cared for. In this way, care itself is the source of dignity, not something that diminishes us. If we think of care in this manner, then I believe we will address many of the objections that disability scholars have voiced. And it is only care in this sense that is truly care. And then perhaps the quarrel can be reconciled. Okay, that's it. Thank you. I'm done.
Yes. That was absolutely amazing, Professor Kittay. I think in the span of an hour, you've covered such critical issues. I mean, right from the very notion of the socially constructed understanding of disability to actually looking at it in terms of embodiment, bringing on board the notion of lived experience, gender, labor work, care work, and above all, I think the notion of dignity, the notion of nested dependency. I think one of the most the hard-hitting statements was the way you unmasked independence as a fiction, which I think is something that, as those of us who are inhabiting aging bodies are also learning very, very quickly, that this whole notion of autonomy, this whole notion of independence is actually something that is sort of imbued with a great deal of the arrogance of youth and able-bodiedness. And I think the notion of the kinds of interdependencies and the way in which human sociality itself is built upon the notion of dependence and interdependence and mutuality. And I think the last part of your lecture, which really had some profound lessons in terms of how care can be oppressive. What we believe to be care can also end up being something that is profoundly disrespectful or oppressive to the recipient of care. I think all these are things about which we will be, those of us who are caregivers ourselves would hopefully reflect upon these. Those of us who are in need of care would also reflect upon these. And I think that in the entire discourse of disability studies, these ideas, these understandings of care would be taken aboard so that research can be more nuanced and our understanding of the lived experience of disability can be enriched and made more subtle, made more rich by these understandings of care. So thank you for this really, really wonderful presentation. And we do apologize for any technical glitches that may have, happened.
No, I think they were on my, I think they were probably on my side too, because as I said, I had some problem having to use a new computer. So
anyway, there are, I noticed, a lot of questions in the chat box, and I think one of the first comments that I noticed was about gender. I think there was a question about the gendered understanding of disability, of how a child's gender impacts the kind of trajectory that is taken in a family's caregiving journey. So I think if you'd like to talk a little bit about that, that would be great.
It's a very interesting question. I don't really know, and it's kind of distressed me that I haven't been able to think more about what the fact that the person that I interact with most, who is a disabled person, is a woman. She's not a girl anymore. She let me know she doesn't want to be a girl anymore. She wants to be a woman. I mean, the issues come up in terms of adults in the question of sexuality, for example. And I might think differently about the sexual life of my very severely disabled child who can't communicate if they were male rather than female. I may be more protective and more wary of any possibility of her having a sexual life that can avoid exploitation. Now, why do I think that in case of the girl instead of the boy? It's means unraveling all sorts of questions about how we think about sex and gender, sexuality and gender. So I don't know how to think about this, and I really encourage other people to do that, to think about that. I think there's a big difference between a very significantly disabled child, such as my daughter, and one with very few disabilities. And so that's a whole different matter. So a woman, for example, with mild intellectual disabilities may truly resent not being viewed as a sexual being. And the parenting would have to be in line with that. Yeah, that's all I have to say about that. Sorry, I can't be more enlightening. I can't hear you.
Yeah, another very interesting question that when a disabled person, instead of being at the receiving end, as they say, actually becomes the caregiver, how does the power dynamic change? Does power play change?
Yes, and there's been some very interesting work by people who talk about communities of care, where they try to break down this dichotomy of caregiver and the dependent and the dependency worker. I think doing that, being where you're in a situation where you can do that, some of the problems with dependency might be resolved. However, I do think that even if you have communities of care where one person cares for someone in one way and the cared for cares for the caregiver in another way, at the sort of micro level, you still have the relationship of dependent and caregiver. So it may not be a distinction that carries, throughout the day or throughout the life, but it's carried on in the moment of caregiving and the subsequent, the subsequent moments of caregiving. So when a previous dependent becomes a caregiver, this is also a situation where many adults have to care for their parents who were caregivers when they were children. And that's often very difficult. For some, it's very easy. And for other people, caregivers, it's very difficult to be cast in the position of a cared for. And I think that a lot of the stigma of dependency that we feel, even when we want to say dependency is not so terrible, and we're taking care of this dependent, we still inhabit it. So the caregiver still holds on to many of the ideals of independence and the stigma of dependency. And that can be a very, very hard road to negotiate, particularly in thick relationships.
Now, the rather interesting question, with disability care ethics, what can be our perspective to look at the care relationship between Anne Sullivan and Helen Keller? Would you like to take that? Yeah.
Oh my. I mean, I imagine in some regards, it looks like what I've talked about. But the fact that Helen Keller could become such a fully amazingly functioning person in the larger society, I think changes that dynamic somewhat. She has a great deal more power once she becomes known, and she can also direct the care much more precisely, the care that she needs much more precisely. Also, there's an interesting question about the interpreter, who I see here on the screen. Is the interpreter a caregiver? And I've had some preliminary discussions with a fellow philosopher who is deaf and has done a lot of interesting work on deafness and disability. And there are ways in which the interpreter is, and there are ways in which the interpreter isn't and shouldn't be viewed that way. So each of these situations of care, have their own dynamics. I think what I've tried to do, if you will, is kind of pull out some logic of the caring situation, of the caregiving situation, which takes on many different forms in the different kinds of relationships where one person is assisting another. And I'd say assisting as well as caregiving. I mean, I think of assistance as also a form of caregiving, because I don't think of caregiving in this narrow sense. I mean, some of the principles and the definitions that I put out there, I think they hold for most kinds of situations, but they may have to be modified and rethought in different kinds of situations. They're kind of guides to how one might think about care. I think the business of taking up care is essential to any caregiving situation, even to the caregiving situation of someone not like Helen Keller, but someone more like my daughter, who is, extremely, extremely dependent and can't direct my care in the way in which Keller could direct her assistance and care, or the way that she might not have been able to when she was young. But even in that situation, I think the caregiver needs to look at what the cared for wants and needs are from their perspective, and not simply act paternalistically and impose their own. I think that's part of good parenting. I think that's part of good caregiving.
Somebody has raised the very, very difficult question of how you place the question of euthanasia with regard to an ethics of care, and also goes on to ask about the role of the state. Particularly, she cited the case of Britney Spears and the kind of abusive care that was enforced care and abuse by the caregiver, and the role of the state in the case of a person.
Yeah, well, I always see care as being not just personal, but also political. So when you have laws that can be abused in the ways in which Britney Spears experienced them, those have to be looked at, they have to be re-examined, they have to be reformed. And it exemplifies some of the worst aspects, the worst failures of care, which have to do with domination and the imposition of one other's sense of good or needs or wants on the cared for, without sufficient respect for the cared for. Euthanasia. is care of a dying, I think there is a larger question, is care, how do you talk about care for a dying person? Because, I mean, is death part of our flourishing? Supposedly not. But perhaps a good death is part of flourishing. Perhaps a death in which we're respected for the person we are, where you have loved ones about you, I think the state has a role in creating conditions for a good death, whatever that might mean. And that needs to be figured out and talked about, and it will be very different in different situations. Because while death is not flourishing, a good death is part of it, I think, a flourishing life. I know what the objections are to euthanasia by the disability community, and I certainly see many of the objections. And I think you're talking about euthanasia in the case of an older person, not in the case of an infant. On the other hand, I think there may be some kinds of suffering at the end of life that is just not worth enduring when one knows that life is going to end, for sure. The problem with care and public policy is that care is very particularistic and public policy is very general. And so the trick is to create policies that leave room for the particularistic without thereby leaving room for abuse. But that is the trick. As far as euthanasia of newborns, I mean, I think someone like Peter Singer is so far off. We know so little about what these neonates, even with very significant disabilities, how they can develop, what they can do. And I think I think the presumption should be for life. There may be cases where that presumption is overwritten, but I think the presumption should be for life. I can't hear you.
A couple of final questions, which we could, if you just like to take them up. One is the issue of consent in the caregiving relationship, and the other is the issue of overprotection, which may hinder flourishing. So, could you just talk a little bit about that?
Mm-hmm. Overprotection is caring too much. It's a failure of care. The intent to care is certainly there. And it's very difficult for people who are parents or caregivers of people with intellectual disabilities, not to be overprotective. On the other hand, as I said, some aspects of the ability to be self-determining may be part of the disability. There one might have to act in ways that look overprotective, but may not really be, if that ability for self-determination is itself undercut, is itself the disability. So people, for example, who can't control their appetites, who can't control and can't be talked out of, constantly going to the refrigerator, whenever possible, and really harming themselves and possibly very significantly harming themselves by overeating. And there's we just might have to face, there's a control there that needs to be there, but just isn't there, and the person who does the caregiving has to step in there. So I think in terms of overprotection, I see, does overprotectiveness create hindrance to their path to independence, or is it better to expose them to vulnerable situations? Depends on what kinds of vulnerabilities. I mean, really, one has to have a good grasp of what the capacities are, the capabilities are, and where one can let go a bit, where one can let go. I think just taking, exposing them to vulnerable situations, taking risks, all the dignity of risk taking, I think, is the expression in the disability community now. One of the primary tasks of parenting, Sarah Ruddick writes, is preservative love. And when one's dealing with a person who has cognitive difficulties, one just has to be wise as to where to exert that preservative love. There isn't one thing, there isn't one answer, but there does need to be a lot of reflection on the part of the caregiver as to whether or not whether they understand the cared for significantly well, and can understand where to expose them to vulnerable situations. I let my teenage son go caving. I didn't even know he went caving, but he did all sorts of things that, my mother would never let me do. And precisely because my mother would never let me do them, I let him do that. But I had a lot of trust in his judgment, and I had reason to trust his judgment. Things could have gone terribly wrong. Things can always go terribly wrong. But you have to know who you're dealing with, what you're dealing with, what capacities you're dealing with. And a sort of just a blanket, the dignity of risk. I'm not all for that. Look at what the risk entails for that individual and whether that risk is really dignifying for that individual, because it may not be, it may just be terribly destructive. So that's my response to that. I can't hear you again.
Just a minute. Yeah, we are reaching the end of our allotted time, I think. But I'd just like to read you out a comment, Professor, from one of the participants, in which she says, "Thank you so much, Professor. Your talk felt like therapy. I didn't realize I needed to hear thoughts on care and independence until I actually listened to you today. Thank you." I think I can't think of a more, a fitting kind of a way to conclude this discussion. And once again, I was delighted to be a part of it. And thank you so much, Dr. Sati. I'll hand it over now to him to wind up the discussion and do the honors. Thank you so much.
And thank you
So much, Shubhangi, for moderating the session with such dexterity, poise, and ease. I think you were absolutely right when you read out that comment that the session was absolutely amazing and above all therapeutic. Thank you, Professor Kittay, for outlining the ethics and, dare I say, the politics of care, and illuminating a number of issues that needed to be elaborated with great nuance. But what I really admired was your ability to present in a nutshell such a wide range of issues, from the myth of independence to the importance of dependence and to the oppressive nature of care itself. Thank you so much. It was a great pleasure hosting you. We really enjoyed your session, and I'm sure that all the participants would agree with me that this was a session to remember, a memorable one. Thank you so much, Professor Kittay, and I hope that you are able to join us in future for future programs and discussions that the center may organize. Thank you, Professor.
I certainly hope
Thank
so.
you.
I certainly hope so. I have yet to go to India. I haven't been to India yet.
Oh, that would be wonderful if you could come over.
How can I continue like this without being able to go to India? So I hope someday I'll be able to.
And Shubhangi has been a friend of the center, though the center is very young, but even before its formation, she has taken part in a number of activities that happened in college. So thank you, Shubhangi, for really being a true friend. And we hope that we continue our association. And I should also thank the participants for putting in very interesting and probing questions into the chat box. But let me end the day by thanking the sign language interpreters for really being out there and interpreting these lectures with utmost calm and precision. Thank you so much, Gargi and Stuti, for your hard work. And I think that is something that everybody is appreciating. They say that the speakers are changing, but the sign language interpreters go on. And that is really an appreciation that everybody has put in through emails or even in chat box. Thank you for that great therapeutic and memorable session. And we draw the day to a close with the announcement that we meet tomorrow at 4 p.m. with another lecture in the series, Why Does Disability Research Matter? And just a gentle reminder that the link would remain the same. Thank you so much and good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. For me, the day starts. Thank you.